So, oh, thank you very much to everybody. It's not a good time, 5 o'clock in the afternoon is the hour of toros and corridas here in Spain. And well, let's try to do our best under not my best conditions today because of the second vaccine I received yesterday, and I am with a little bit of fever. Our knowledge of the fascinating Mozarabic intellectual world in the 11th and 12th centuries owes much to Professor Van Koningsveld and Tom Burman, whose perspective research has helped to carve the influence of Latin and Eastern Christian scholars and their works on Mozarabic intellectual life, and also to trace possible links between these groups and certain Jewish converts. Little is yet known, however, about the influences shaping Mozarabic intellectual activity over the first 300 years, that is, from the 8th to 10th centuries, and more particularly about the links forged between Latin and Arabized Mozarabs and the transmission of knowledge from the Latin Christian to the Arabized Christian milieu. It is obvious that we have a lack of Arabic documents produced by bilingual Latin Arabic authors. There is every indication that what we might term the systematic use of Arabic among Christian intellectuals in Al-Andalus began in the late 9th century. In all likelihood, the cultural climate shared by intellectuals under the reign of Al-Hakam II, the second part of the 10th century, fostered by his famous library, first emerged a century earlier, albeit in humbler and more varied circumstances, at least in terms of the systematic translation and production of Christian works in Arabic. Further evidence of the acceptance of Arabization in the 9th century is to be found in the text and information circulating almost interchangeably in Arabic and Latin in Mozarabic circles at the time. Collections of texts related to Orosius' Universal History, geographical publications based on Julius Honorius, as well as information drawn from John of Biclar and Isidore of Seville, for example. Such examples are by no means unique. The Mozarabic author of the Prophetic Chronicle displayed a thorough knowledge of the Islamic world and of Arabic sources, and combined the information he found there with the influence of Eastern Christian apocalyptic writings. However, a certain amount of information can be gleaned from several Arabic texts currently believed to date from the 9th century, if not earlier. These include the Epistle to the Galatians, and of course the translation of the Book of Psalms made by Hafs ben al-Kuti, as well as other possible texts attributed to this author. These Arabic translations, coupled with information available on the 9th century, would suggest that Latin Arabized and Mozarabic intellectuals led a more active literary life at an earlier stage than has hitherto been assumed. Ideas and works central to the Latin heritage were transferred, used, translated, and transmitted among Mozarabic intellectuals in a number of ways. The question of how that legacy was transmitted and how it was used merits further and detailed research. What appears certain is that Arabized Christian intellectuals owed a great deal to their Latin heritage, to its authors and the ideas they expressed, and made extensive use of it in their own texts in Arabic. A good example is provided by the series of fragments quoted by a Muslim scholar from Córdoba named Abu Abbas Ahmad ben Omar al-Ansari al-Qurtubi, who lived from the end of 12th century to the mid of 13th century. He wrote a very important book for all people interested in polemics called Al-I'lam, the Information. One of the works quoted in this book, in Al-I'lam by al-Qurtubi, is known as Tathlith al-Wahdaniyya. In Arabic, in English, something like traveling the oneness or trinitizing the uniqueness, more or less. In a former publication, a colleague and myself have examined a hypothesis formulated by Tom Burman regarding the use of the triad by Ramon Martí. Our colleague Burman noted that in the Trinitarian arguments set forth in his Pugio Fidei, Martí drew on an apologetic tradition, by then well established in Spain, an area highly receptive to ideas and arguments of this kind, which indeed circulated much more extensively than hitherto assumed. In the same paper, Burman additionally suggested that the anonymous author of the Tathlith may have belonged to the circle of Archbishop Jiménez de Rada, 14th century. In the intellectual context to which the anonymous author clearly belonged, shaped by the practice of kalam, that is the Muslim theology, but also drawing on a thorough familiarity with Christian polemic and apologetic techniques of earlier centuries, the influence of Latin theology indicated by his use of the triad, in Latin, potentia voluntas benignitas, should perhaps be viewed as part of a heritage with which the author of the Tathlith was fully acquainted. With regard to the vexed question of whether he was conversant specifically with the Latin triad, we should perhaps conclude that he may already have had some notion of it, either through the work of Eastern Christian philosophers via the Christian Arabic kalam, or as we shall see, through that of Latin Mozarabic authors. The author of the Tathlith may have been aware of the triad as used by Eastern Christian theologians, which matches one of the two known Latin forms. In Arabic, we have the readings given in Eastern lands as Qudra, potentia, Hikma, sapientia, and Yaud, which can be translated as benignitas or bonitas, that is the exact terms as transmitted among Latin Mozarabs, derived from the original Greek dynamis, gnosis, agathotes. And this Greek just related with Syriac or Syriac-Aramaic, taibuto, hemkto, medmasiano. This triad was formulated by Proclus Diadochus in his Elementatio Theologica and translated into Arabic by a disciple of the Nestorian Hunayn ben Ishaq, called Abu Uthman al-Dimashqi, between 9th and 10th centuries, under the title Kitaba Theologia, the Book of Theology. The Latin theological tradition espoused by Hugh of St. Victor in France and his followers furnished a second formulation of the triad, potentia, sapientia, voluntas. If you remember, the first one was potentia, sapienta, benignitas, or bonitas. What we have now here a change. Benignitas or bonitas is changed by voluntas, which is the version used by the author of the Tathlith. Qudra for potentia, hilm for sapientia, and now irada for voluntas, which is the exact translation of the Latin term. This formulation, which can be traced to Basil of Caesarea, and more specifically to his description of God as agathos, sophos, dynatos, was transmitted to the Latin world by Ambrose of Milan, and would therefore have been familiar, at least for exegetical purposes, to Latin Mozarabic authors. This context of theological hybridization, dating back to the Visigothic period, is highly significant, since the adaptation of the Latin triad testifies to the fact that at least some revised Christian theologians were conversant with and drew on the two theological traditions underpinning their religious circumstances. The Latin tradition, not only in its Mozarabic and Carolingian expressions, but also was expressed through the work of Abelard, the work of Hugh of St. Victor, and their followers, and of course, the Eastern Christian tradition as well. But is there another possible canal of transmission for these and other theological expressions used by the Mozarabs? Although some scholars have argued that the theological controversies raging in the 8th century Spain were a symptom of the decline of the Visigothic Church, such polemics are better regarded as proof of its vitality and of the solid intellectual training of its theologians. The doctrines debated at the various councils held in Toledo over the last quarter of the 7th century in which the issue of the Trinity loomed large, showed that contemporary theologians, both then and in the following century, clearly helped to carry certain ideas into the 9th century. Even the Trinitarian doctrine propounded by Migetius, though its core principles, according to Olipandos, were shoddy and absurd, reflects an effort to explain to the common Christian in simple terms a theological mystery which lay beyond his grasp. The migration of theologians also had a significant impact. A good example is Felix of Urgel, who in the late 8th century left the realms of Charlemagne, that is Alexander the Great, Charles the Great, Charles the Great, in search of a place where he could fully express his adoptionist theological views. He found solace amongst the Mozarabs in Córdoba, the city and its province being home to numerous adoptionists who perhaps enjoyed close intellectual links with Nestorian communities as well. In this climate of controversy and migration, a possible example of the way theological ideas and concepts were transmitted between cultures is to be found in Abbot Samson's Apologeticum, one of the best celebrated intellectuals in 9th century Córdoba. This lengthy discourse, was prompted by a number of serious accusations leveled against Samson, who lived between 810 and 890, at the time of abbot of the monastery of Peñamelaria in the north of Córdoba, by Ostigisis, Bishop of Malaga, a loyal collaborator with the Islamic administration. Samson was fluent in Arabic and was often called upon to translate documents from Arabic into Latin and from Latin into Arabic for the Islamic authorities. He was thus one of the many 9th century Arabized Christians for whom Arabic provided a full channel for the acquisition and transmission of learning. As the title indicates, Samson's Apologeticum was written in defense of his Catholic faith. As such, the text fits perfectly into the polemic context. It sets out the arguments and attacks with which Samson seeks to demolish his opponent Ostigisis, himself a Christian, but in Samson's view, a false Christian whose desire for personal advancement prompted him to kowtow to the Islamic authorities. Though intended as an apologetic work, its arguments contain valuable polemical material. The text was clearly well known to Mozarabic theologians from the 9th century onwards, and had a varying degree of influence on Arabized Christian polemicists as well. The theological doctrine of the Trinity, a core element of the Apologeticum, had been widely debated in Christian circles since the days of the Church Fathers, but assumed particular significance among 8th century Spanish theologians, beset by the contemporary emergence of various heresies and adoptionist ideas. It had remarkable repercussions for the church in 9th century Córdoba. In his letter to Abbot Esperaindeo, the also celebrated Alvarus of Córdoba complains that, in Latin, caput autem ipsorum nequissimum, quod falcesit veritatis resecatum, illut est quod trinum in unitate et unum in trinitate. In English, the worst aspect of this doctrine may be cut down by the circle of truth, is that they refuse to believe that God is triune, in unity, and one in Trinity. A complaint to which Esperaindeo later provides a detailed reply. The debate is also acknowledged by Samson at the end of the chapter entitled Of the Essential Unity of the Whole Trinity, in Latin, De Unione Essentiae Totius Trinitatis, which sets out the Catholic doctrine, or his Catholic doctrine more properly. Tamara, please, can you put the first slide? One interesting parallel with the Tathlith, or not this, I think, see, okay, it's okay. One interesting parallel with the Tathlith is an insistence on the importance of divine governance. Samson's claim that you can read in your slide, Deus terrestria format vivificat governat moderatut et regit. You have below the translation, God forms, gives life, governs, moderates, and rules earthly affairs. It's perceptibly rendered by the author of the Tathlith using the concepts halika, creation, and tadbir, which means the same as regid. This parallel of the topos of the divine governance, tadbir, in the Tathlith is preceded by a passage in which readers are urged to give thanks. Please, the second slide. To give thanks, praise, and glorify God. Well, you can, if someone can read in Arabic, so Farada lahu shakirin, hamidin, mahdimin, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to give you the translation in English. It is our duty to give thanks, to praise and glorify him without comprehending his senses or apprehending any part of him. Rather, we know only the names of his acts through the act of his creation and in his governance through his divinity. But this is not the only coincidence between the two books. Interestingly, the Apologeticum, third slide, please. The Apologeticum refers, albeit for several purposes, the text contained in Matthew 25, 31, 32. Cum venerit filius hominis, blah, blah, blah. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all the nations, and he shall separate them from another, as a shepherd divided his sheep from the goats. Next one, please, Tamara. The Tathlith renders this with a gloss on the formula Ibn al-Insan, filius hominis. In the text you can see in your slide. Fakada Ibn al-Insan, Atni al-Hijab, blah, 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 blah. In English, the Son of Man, that is the veil chosen from the progeny of Adam, this is the gloss, and then continues, shall sit upon the throne of his glory, and all the nations shall gather in his presence, and he shall separate them as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Given that the name is bound to its essence, the name of God, of course, Samson states that just as the three persons are designated in the singular, so there is a single essence. Next slide, Tamara, please. Here you have the text, Nequest ecum diversas essentias. In English, it is wrong to suspect different essences within the Holy Trinity, for the three persons are designated by the word of God itself in the singular. If just as there are three persons, there were also three natures, then he would say, in the names of, rather than in the name of, and nothing would remain of what truly supported the Lord's reply to the tempter. Next one, please, Tamara. The author of the Tathlith says the same thing, although not literally. In English, but if you say, why do you not say, in the name of the powerful, the knowing, and the willing? He's just playing with different names of God, a very peculiar technique used in the Kalam milieu, instead of in the name of the Father, the Son, of the Holy Spirit. Then it is evident that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are each one third. The Trinitarian formula used, undoubtedly a key issue in the Tathlith, is a different matter. The formula employed by the author of the Tathlith, though not taken verbatim, word by word, from the Apologeticum, clearly echoes it. This is evident, for example, next slide, Tamara, please. This is evident, for example, in the concepts of strength, wish, and goodness, bonitas. I'm going to give you the translation in English. Rather, that the strength of the Godhead, which is somehow in all things created by his goodness. Reference is made in several passages to the concept of wisdom, sapientia, combined with that of knowledge, scientia, which is the strict equivalent of Arabic ilm. Elsewhere, we even find that the concept of voluntas, sapientia, and fortitudo are joined by a fourth, eternitas, eternity. The triad in the Apologeticum, voluntas, sapientia, and fortitudo, thus forms part of a broader chain of concepts comprising the nomina Dei, also to be found in the Tathlith, although with a different discursive purpose and leading to a different final formulation of the triad. Despite these differences, the evidence clearly points to the transmission of theological ideas and concepts within bilingual Mozarabic communities, in which theological knowledge was essential to the shaping of the intellect between the 8th and 12th centuries. As these and many other examples not mentioned here for questions of time show, there is no specific evidence that the Tathlith drew directly on the Apologeticum. However, certain elements, including quotations, are common to the two works. The arguments expounded in the Apologeticum are certainly more elaborate and more complex in terms of the theological exegesis provided by Abbot Samson than those of the Tathlith, whose discourse, though perceptive and perfectly extracted, appears somewhat simpler. This is clearly appreciable in the case of the triad. The Greek transmission of the three terms agathotes, dynamis, gnosis, or the variant from Basil of Caesarea, agathos, sophos, dynatos, into Latin bonus, sapiens, potens, which was established in the East as early as the 5th century and over the following centuries was transmitted through various channels to Latin and Latin Arabic Mozarabic theologians. The fact that the anonymous 12th century author of the Tathlith may have adopted the formula devised by theologians of the French school of Hugues of St. Victor does not necessarily signify that he was unaware of a different triad circulating among the Mozarabic intellectuals before they were influenced by the Latin theology of Hugues of St. Victor and Peter Abelard. Mozarabic theologians, needing appropriate instruments and a fighting discourse with which to defend themselves and attack their opponents, Christian heretics, Muslims, and Jewish theologians, not only had access to materials well suited to their purpose, including their Western and Eastern Christian heritage, but also developed their own theological solid discourse, whose arguments, circulating in a range of formats, were adapted to meet the specific purposes and requirements of each author. As the few surviving fragmentary texts prove, it is intellectually naive to assume that the Mozarabic Latin theological tradition was simply abandoned to its fate, and that Arabized Christians set out in a different direction, shaped by subsequent Latin theological influences. Such a view is futile, just as it is futile in sociological and especially in intellectual terms, to divide the Mozarabic community into distinct groups, Latin Mozarabs and Arabized Mozarabs. This is totally wrong. It is only to be expected that Christian intellectuals, from the early Visigoths to the Mozarabic theologians, polemicists, and apologists of the 8th and 9th centuries, should be aware of and to some extent rely on the Latin tradition. This is quite clear. Indeed, it is the only way of accounting for the content of the few works in Arabic written by bilingual Latin Arabic Mozarabs. Even so, we must proceed with great caution when analyzing these and other aspects of the Tathlith, which after all has come down to us in a fragmentary form rather than as a complete work. Given their content, these fragments may not be drawn from a complete work, but rather from independent, though related sections, and even from different tracts. Moreover, we cannot know whether the fragments preserved in Al-I'lam were polished, adapted, or even manipulated or mutilated to meet the polemicist purposes of Al-Imam al-Qurtubi after he included the quotations of the Tathlith in his book, Al-I'lam. Thank you very much for your attention.